Good afternoon. I'm Dan with Four Winds Ancestral Skills. Today it will be our second in a series of making stone tools. Specifically, today we'll be working with some basic flint knapping. So, number one, I'm going to go over some safety precautions. Then I'll go over some of the tools we use to do some basic flint knapping. Then three, I'll explain basically how to do it, and then finally I will go over and make an actual arrowhead from a piece of obsidian. So stick around. First thing we want to talk about is safety. Doesn't matter how good you are at making stone tools if you're laying out here behind a tree somewhere bleeding out. So to prevent that, you need to follow a few simple safety precautions. Number one, when you're working with stone, it can be extremely sharp, as in sharper than steel. So be very careful of those edges. Use a leg pad. Make sure you have a pad on your hand when you're working it. Just be very careful of those edges and make sure that you can't prevent all cuts, but try to minimize them and do the best you can. It's always good to have some band-aids on hand because you're probably going to get little nicks here and there while you're working with it, but ideally, as long as they're just something small, you're not going to die from it. So next up, it's good to wear, when you're working with stone, some kind of safety glasses. I like to wear sunglasses. Keeps the sun out of my eyes, and it keeps sharp little fragments of rock from getting in my eyes. The tiny sharp pieces of rock suck when they stick in your hand, but 10 times worse if they get in your eyes. So always take that into consideration. Lastly, obviously not a problem out here, but ventilation. You want to make sure you have good ventilation when you're working with stone. So if you don't, as you're working it, small particles of stone can get into your lungs and they will cut up your lungs, and if you have a ton of it, you can get something called silicosis, where you get too much of that crap in your lungs and it will actually damage your lungs. We're outdoors right now, so we have plenty of ventilation, but something to keep in mind if you're doing it in a back room or a shed somewhere. Just make sure you have plenty of ventilation when you work with this stuff. Alright, next up I'm going to go over the tools that are used for flint knapping. There's modern tools that are used and also primitive tools. The more modern ones like copper and aluminum, things like that, those are excellent, especially for a beginner to start on, and they make flint knapping a little bit easier, a little easier to work with. Next up we'll be going over the primitive types of tools after that. We're using stone, antler, that sort of thing to make points. It's perfectly acceptable. It will work. It won't work quite as easily and takes a little more practice to get a hang of it, but they are good things to know, especially for being out in the field and making some primitive type tools, especially if you understand the concepts. If you can work with deer antler, you can, in a pinch, work with, say, a hardwood, something like that. So just keep that in mind. Now, working with tools, number one thing you want to do is have some kind of good pad. They really help out. They help keep you from getting those cuts that we were talking about earlier. There's a million different kinds. Rubber, there's leather, there's thick rubber pads that you can use. I always just prefer basic rawhide padding like this right here. You can see it's seen quite a bit of use, but one or two of these, and that's what I use for pretty much all my flint knapping. Next up, for a percussion flaker, here's an example. It's kind of a medium-sized aluminum billet. This works pretty well for most things. It's kind of a general purpose size. There's different kinds of sizes out there. Most of them I find are copper. They work about the same as this one. Aluminum, copper, they both work pretty well. The bigger ones used for bigger reduction, and then they have down to smaller sizes, but like I said, this is kind of a medium-sized one, so it's general purpose. It'll work pretty well being this size for 90% of the work you would do. Next thing is pressure flaking. I have two examples right here of pressure flaking. This first one is just a dowel rod, essentially, with a copper rod glued in place. These slowly wear down as you use them, so you have to keep that in mind. This one here, it will eventually be more or less worthless without, taking this glued tip off and maybe put another copper rod in there, but this thing will wear out, and you really can't do much with it when it is worn out. Then this one is a plastic rod that was drilled into, and it has two set screws on either side. So you can undo these, and this here is basically just a copper nail. So as this wears down, you can pull the copper nail out, give yourself a little bit more, tighten it back down, keep it sharp, makes better working in tighter places and stuff like that. But this one works same principle as this one, but this one's a lot easier to continue to maintain, keep sharp, and be able to replace the tip ultimately. Finally, I have this here. It's a braider, a braiding stone. You want to utilize this while you're working the rock to help work with the platforms. It's essentially when you have sharp edges and you try to either pressure flake them or percussion flake them, depending on what you're working with, they will just crush. They won't actually produce a flake off of that, which is not optimal, definitely. But if you abrade it, you can strengthen that edge, and then you can get a flake off it. So abrading is not the most glamorous part of the whole flint-knapping process, but it is a critical part that will help you get better flakes. And with something like this, you can do pretty much 90% of flint knapping you would need to do normally to make a basic functional point. There's other things like indirect percussion, where you're combining the percussion aspect, but you're essentially taking a longer rod, you place it onto the stone, and then you actually hit the rod itself to break the piece down. I don't have an example of that here. I don't use those terribly often. I'm getting more into it now and kind of getting some experience with it, but you don't necessarily need something like that to make a point. Ultimately, you only need, not even necessarily that, but ultimately you only need these three items here, and you can make a functional point. Maybe not the most pretty thing in the world, but it'll get the job done. Next up, we're talking about primitive tools. Same thing, still have our leather pad, but talking about percussion flaking, this here is an antler billet. Now it works similar to the aluminum billet I have. It works a little bit differently because this is a softer material than the aluminum, but kind of the same principle. You strike the stone with it and shear off the flakes. Antler billet, there's different sizes. This is a decently big size. They also have moose antler billets, and pretty much every type of antler is a little bit different hardness and everything, but they operate more or less the same way. So that's good for percussion flaking. You can also use stone for percussion flaking. Reacts a little bit differently. The antler grabs the flakes off a little bit more. When you strike it, it kind of conforms to the edge a little bit more and rips it off a little bit more. Whereas a hammerstone they make different types of flakes, and really you need to get some experience to kind of get an idea exactly how they differ. Like I said, normally you can get better, longer, thinner flakes with an antler, but hammerstones work well depending on the situation you're using them for. We have here a couple examples of pressure flakers. And just the tip here we use to, same purpose as the copper tip on the other one. It just pulls off those small flakes off a smaller piece that you're working with. So same thing, these wear down faster than the copper does, and you have to end up sharpening it, and it will continue to sharpen down as you go, and then you have to eventually toss this, replace it with another one. But these work pretty well. Like I said, they don't last as long, but if you get used to them, they do work well. Finally, abrading, still important. A little bit easier finding abrading stones out here, at least where I am here in the Ozarks. There's rocks everywhere, and they're generally rough rocks. This is an example of what I have here. But same thing, it'll work just like the abrading stone. Just grinding off the edge, so any kind of rough stone will work for that. You don't have to have anything special. You could even use just this rock that I'm working on right now. Same thing, just you have to abrade those edges, and rough stones are usually pretty easy to find in a lot of places. So that's just what you want to keep in mind for that. Now that we've gone over some of the tools that we'll be using, we want to take a look at the actual rock and how we decide how to utilize those tools and get the types of flakes we want off of there. When you have a piece of stone like this, obviously it's got irregular edges that you can see there. So we'll talk a little bit about the theory real quick. Say you're looking at the top edge of the stone. This might be a little exaggerated, but some stones are pretty crazy. But say you're looking at the edge of this stone here, and it looks something like this. Well, the first thing you want to do is picture where the actual center line of the stone is. One big rule when you're doing flint knapping is you don't want to cross the center line of the stone you're working with. If there's a ridge coming out to this side, what you want to do is flake that off to that direction. If there's a ridge on this side, you want to flake that off this direction. You generally don't want to go across unless you're maybe setting up a platform, which I'll talk about here in a second. But normally that's the layout, both with pressure flaking and percussion flaking, that you want to do. You want to not cross the center line and ultimately get a flat piece, or at least as flat as you can, piece of stone off of this thing. And by taking essentially the ridges on each side off, you're more or less accomplishing that. Now the next thing we got to talk about, say I have this piece of stone here, and there's a ridge coming out to one side or another. Like, I'm not sure if you can see it terribly well, but there's a piece here. You can see it dips down here, and it is to this side of the center line. So this is a good place to be striking it. Now, what we want to make sure when we are working with this here is that we have a good, what's called a platform. So, say I strike this edge and there's not a good platform, it will just crush the edge, and you won't get any kind of flake off it. You'll just get a crush, and it won't have the desired results. So what I'm going to do is, normally you can just abrade this edge right here. So I take this abrading stone, abrade this really good, and then this should be strong enough to withstand a strike for percussion. Something this size, you want to do percussion. The pressure flaking really comes into more of a lot of the finer work, but I will strike this here and I'll show you what happens. Alright. As you can see, struck it right here. The cone of force, when you strike, will expand out. And as you can see, this piece right here came off. So there's a ridge right here, a high spot, and when I struck down here, this piece, right like that, flaked off. And this is what I got. It's that easy. Now, as you're practicing, don't get discouraged if you don't get halfway decent flakes like that. Sometimes it takes a little bit. But now we have a flake here. We can take this and then we can make an arrowhead out of it, which I'll show you here in a little bit. But that's the principle of it. You want to make sure that you're working from the center lines, and you want to make sure that you have a good platform for the work you're doing. Those are the two big things that you want to try to keep in mind when you're doing flint knapping. Everything else you can kind of play with a little bit, but that's the two main things that you want to try to keep in mind. Alright, now that we have this small flake from that larger piece over there, we're going to take this and shape it into an arrowhead. And I'll show you how to do that here. First off, like I said before, it's good to have some safety glasses. Next up, the edges on this thing are extremely sharp. That's where a braidor comes in. Take these sharp edges here and break those down. Those sharp edges, you can utilize those directly, say if you want to cut something or process an animal, anything like that. You can take a raw piece like this is extremely sharp and utilize it for cutting. But if you're making a usable tool out of it, you want to cut those edges down. So just hit those edges up. We want strong pieces. And to do that, we need to braid the heck out of it. Alright. Okay, now that we got the edges abraded, it's the same principle that on the bigger piece. You want to take a look at the center line and work back and forth from there. So right now I have kind of an odd shaped thing here. We want to turn this into an arrowhead. So we have to look at the piece, kind of see where optimally that would be. And I can kind of picture what would be a good shape for it right here. But what I need to do is take my pressure flaker and my pad, and there's different ways you can hold it. Some people, when they're flint knapping, they'll have the piece of stone they're working with, put it right here on their leg, strike it. That's generally how I do the bigger pieces. I do some of the pressure flaking on my leg. Some of the smaller stuff I hold like this. And it just kind of depends on the piece. But I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick. One important thing when you're doing this is you want to make sure that the piece is adequately supported. If it's not, it can easily snap, especially the thinner you make it. It's It's a very disheartening feeling when you're almost done with the point you've been working with a decent amount of time, and then it ends up snapping on you and you have to go from there. So when you're working with it, and what I'm doing right now is mainly just roughing it out to make it into shape, and then I'm going to go from there and actually sharpen it up. And as you can see, I already cut myself a little bit here. It happens. It's not a big deal. If you are very careful, you won't get anything serious. You'll get little nicks like this and stuff, but nothing too bad. It's always good to have a decent supply of Band-Aids for just such an occasion. And when you're going along here, once you get a little more confident, you can go a little bit faster. But especially when you're first starting out, it's good to be kind of careful about it and decently methodical so you don't make any mistakes or snap a piece, because like I say, it sucks when you've been working on a piece and then all of a sudden something bad happens and it snaps. It's a little bit disheartening, but going slow, taking your time, being methodical about it will help that out. So now you could take something like that, and you could utilize that more or less as it is. Maybe deepen the ridges a little bit, something like that, sharpen it up a little bit more. And you could more or less use something like this. And you saw, well, it's only taken me a few minutes. It's not terribly long from the flake that I chipped off with nothing more than a pressure flaker. You can make a very, very useful point in just a few minutes. Now I might take an extra couple minutes here, put in some notching or something like that. I can easily do that. It only takes a few minutes, especially with a flaker that's fairly sharp like this one is still. But you can make something like this fairly quickly, and it's pretty serviceable and very useful to, like I said, use for an arrowhead, or even if you want to use it just as a cutting point. But something like this would be serviceable. And again, the same principle applies as far as just keep to the center line, working back and forth, try to get the high spots so you can end up with a fairly straight edge. Now when you are going for this edge here, it is good to have a bit of a serrated effect. It makes it a little bit sharper, so you're not looking to try to get it super smooth. It is good to have that little serration, almost like a little serrated blade type of thing. Let's say I got something like this. This is fairly sharp. If I wanted to notch it, you do the same thing. You just pick out, do you want to notch from the side, down by the corner here? Do you want to notch from the rear? Anything like that. You figure out where you want to notch it. You take this and you nibble at it a little bit, and then flip it over, and then do the same thing. And just keep doing that very carefully to where you can put in a little bit of a notch into here. And I'll do that real quick into this one. Oh, see, there you go. If you're not careful, something like that can happen. Notching in, not supporting the piece enough, you can snap it, which it sucks. But this piece is still usable. You could, if you want to make them even, you could snap this other side off, and it would still be certainly a usable arrowhead. But that's a good example of what you have to do when you're flint knapping. Be careful, otherwise that same thing can happen to you. Like I said though, you can basically just kind of work with it, because that's flint knapping. Sometimes you can do your best and then either you lose a little focus, or you think about something else, or just the rock doesn't like you that day, and you end up breaking off a piece. But like I said, not to fear. If it breaks like that, it's not a big deal. You can just, I like to make them a little bit even. Now that one's busted off now, so you can turn this into a little bit different shape point, but ultimately it still works. But that's a good example of, even if it does break on you, it's not the end of the world. You can just reshape it. Reshape it into a little bit different point, and ultimately still be able to use it nonetheless. Alright, this here, a little bit different shape, more of a leaf point design, but you can, same thing, lash it into a stick and achieve the same results. This would still make a functional arrowhead, maybe not quite as pretty as it would have been the other way, but that's life. Oftentimes you got to make do with what you have, and I could take another flake off there and start over, but I think this is probably better anyway, because then you can see me screw up and end up busting a point and realize that, you know, no matter what, bad things can happen when you're doing flint knapping, no matter how good you are. When you get really good, things might not happen as often, but they can still happen, and you end up swearing at your point or making excuses for why it broke. Okay, after just a few minutes, we were able to take that flake and turn it into a bit of a modified leaf-shaped point. Something like this, still very effective for what we need to do it. You can go as long as you want and get prettier points, but ultimately what matters is that it's very sharp. There's a little bit of a serration there, so it can do its job and cut like it's supposed to cut. And really, no matter what it looks like, as long as it's sharp and gets the job done, that's what's important. The principles to make this little arrowhead here can be used to make anything. A big stone blade, a tomahawk, no matter what, the same principles apply. Think about the center line, how you're taking those flakes off, and make sure you have a good platform to work with. You keep that in mind and it'll take you a long way. Now this is a beginner level type video here. This is not advanced level flint knapping, anything like that. It's designed to give you kind of the basics, give you a starting point. Hopefully you can continue learning about this sort of thing, taking either one of my classes or finding somebody else who knows how to do flint knapping and learning in person from them. I find learning in person, you can do a lot more than necessarily watching a video and then trying it on your own. But if you don't know anybody who can teach you this sort of thing, it's a good starting point. Another good starting point is The Art of Flint Knapping. It's, I think, about a 25-year-old book now, but it has a lot of relevant information in it, and it goes deep into the theory of how the cone of force works when you strike a rock, all that sort of thing. You generally don't need to go quite in depth, the knowledge that far. The main thing you need to be able to look for is, where do I need to strike this rock to get the type of flake that I want? And really, you can only get that by doing it, in my opinion. You can only go so far with the theory of flint knapping. You have to really put your hands on the rock and work with it and get to know it, ultimately, to be really good at this. But if you can't get to somebody who knows what they're doing and get some experience with them, then by all means, using the information in this video and maybe some other online resources, get yourself a percussion flaker, a pressure flaker, an abrader of some sort, and some kind of pad to hold it all in, and then some rock. And that's all you need ultimately to get started. Get out there, start breaking some rock, and you'll get a little bit of experience, and that goes a long way. If you want to get a hold of me, you can reach me on my website, fourwindsancestralskills.com. Always glad to chat with people. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, any of that sort of thing, hit me up. If you hated the video, that's fine too. Just let me know. I'm always willing to take some constructive criticism and see how I can do things better. Until next time, I hope to see you on the trail. Take care.